Something just shifted in the NATO-Russia-Iran triangle, and most Americans have no idea what it actually means. A missile launched from Iranian territory, intercepted over Turkish skies by NATO air defenses. On the surface, it looks like a clean defensive win. But if you've been watching how power actually moves in this part of the world, not through headlines, but through back-channel signals, troop repositioning, and the quiet rewriting of alliance structures, you already know that what was shot down wasn't just a missile. It was a test, a probe, a carefully calculated message sent to see exactly how fast NATO responds, where the gaps are, and whether Turkey, i.e., a NATO member that has been quietly expanding its relationships with Moscow and Tehran simultaneously, would allow that interception to happen at all, and it did, which tells you something. The geometry of this conflict is changing, and the United States is about to feel that change in ways that go far beyond a defense budget line. Let's start with Turkey, because Turkey is the key to understanding everything that is unfolding right now. Turkey is one of the most strategically positioned countries on the planet. It sits at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. It controls the Bosphorus Strait, which is the only naval passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and it has the second largest standing army in NATO. That's not a small detail. That's a country that every major power on earth needs to either have on its side or at minimum keep neutral. And for the last several years, Turkey has been playing all sides with remarkable skill. It bought Russian S-400 missile defense systems while remaining a NATO member. It maintained active trade with Russia after the Ukraine war escalated, even as Washington was pressuring every ally to cut Moscow off. It has been deepening economic ties with Iran, and yet it is still formally inside the NATO alliance. That balancing act has frustrated Washington for years. But this missile interception, this event, just forced Turkey's hand in a very public way. When NATO defenses intercepted that missile over Turkish territory, Turkey allowed it. That sounds obvious, but think about what it means in practical terms. Turkey could have managed this differently. It could have downplayed the incident, handled it quietly through diplomatic back channels, avoided the public framing of Iran as an aggressor on Turkish soil. Instead, the story went public, NATO's role went public, and that positions Turkey, whether intentionally or not, as a country that just had to be defended by the Western alliance against a missile coming from the direction of Iran. That is a geopolitical signal of enormous weight. It tells Tehran something, it tells Moscow something, and it tells Washington something too, which is that for all of Turkey's balancing, when a real projectile is moving through the air toward Ankara, it is NATO systems that are shooting it down, not Russian systems, not Iranian diplomacy, NATO hardware. Now, why would Iran fire a missile toward Turkey in the first place? That's the question that should be asked loudly and answered carefully, because the answer shapes everything that comes next. The honest answer is that we don't fully know yet, and that uncertainty itself is part of the story. What we do know is that Iran has been under extraordinary pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. The sanctions architecture that the United States has built around Iran has been tightening. Iran's regional proxies in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Iraq and Syria have been degraded significantly over the past year through Israeli military operations and American strikes. The internal economic situation inside Iran is severe. And the political leadership in Tehran is dealing with a population that is increasingly restless and a military structure that is fractured between hardline factions who want escalation and more pragmatic voices who understand that a full confrontation with NATO would be catastrophic for the Islamic Republic. In that context, a missile, whether fired deliberately, fired by a rogue faction, or fired as part of a miscalculation, lands in a very different way than it would have 5 years ago. There is also a scenario that doesn't get discussed enough in American media, which is the possibility that this event was not entirely what it appeared to be on the surface. In geopolitics, the framing of an incident matters as much as the incident itself. Who was in the room when the decision was made? Was this a state-level decision from the Iranian government, or was it a faction inside the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps acting with a level of autonomy that the central government has increasingly struggled to contain? These are not theoretical questions. The IRGC has operated with significant independence in the past. It has made moves that put the Iranian government in difficult diplomatic positions, and a faction within the IRGC that believes the current Iranian leadership is too soft, too willing to negotiate, too open to a new nuclear framework with the West, that faction would have every reason to create an incident that makes diplomacy harder and escalation more likely. This is how power struggles inside authoritarian governments spill outward into the world. and the United States has not been good at reading those internal fractures in real time. What this means for the broader NATO-Iran dynamic is significant. NATO has just been placed in a position where its defensive posture in the Eastern Mediterranean and the broader Middle Eastern theater has been visibly validated. Alliance systems worked, a threat was neutralized. That is the public narrative, and it is not wrong, but beneath that narrative is a set of questions that alliance planners are now urgently working through. The first question is whether this was a one-time event or a signal of a new operational pattern from Iran. If Iranian factions, state-directed or otherwise, are now willing to fire projectiles toward NATO member territory, then the entire calculus of how NATO positions its air defense assets, how it shares intelligence with Turkey specifically, and how it draws its red lines with Tehran has to be revisited. That is not a small bureaucratic adjustment. That is a fundamental strategic recalibration that will take months to work through and will produce friction inside the alliance as different member states have different risk tolerances and different economic relationships with Iran. Germany, for instance, has significant trade interests that it has tried to protect. France has its own complicated history of diplomatic engagement with Tehran. The Eastern European members of NATO, Poland, the Baltic states, are watching the Iranian situation through the lens of what it means for Russian behavior, because everything in European security right now is being filtered through the question of what Russia is watching and learning. And what Russia is watching here is whether NATO's response to this missile incident is muscular or cautious, whether the alliance uses this moment to tighten its posture and send a strong deterrent message to Iran, or whether internal disagreements cause the response to be muddled and slow. Russia is taking notes, because Russia is always taking notes on NATO cohesion. Now let's talk about what this means for the United States specifically, because that's ultimately the center of gravity here. The United States has been trying to manage an incredibly complex set of simultaneous pressures in this region. It is supporting Israel's military campaign while trying to prevent that campaign from becoming a regional war that draws in American forces at scale. It is trying to maintain some kind of diplomatic opening with Iran around the nuclear file, because the alternative, a nuclear-armed Iran, is a threat that no American administration of either party wants to deal with. It is managing the Turkey relationship with all of its complications around the F-35 program that Turkey was kicked out of after buying the Russian S-400, around Kurdish fighters in Syria that Turkey views as terrorists and the United States has relied on as ground partners, and around Erdogan's personal political style, which does not lend itself to the kind of predictable alliance management that Washington prefers. And now on top of all of that, there is a missile intercept over Turkish soil that puts all of those moving pieces into a new configuration. The pressure on Washington right now is to respond in a way that strengthens the NATO-Turkey relationship without giving Ankara so much leverage that Turkey uses this moment to extract concessions on the F-35, on sanctions policy, on its relationships with Russia and Iran. Erdogan is a skilled negotiator. He has demonstrated repeatedly that he understands how to turn crises into bargaining chips. The United States knows this, and so the American response will be calibrated very carefully. Publicly, there will be strong statements of alliance solidarity. Privately, there will be conversations about what Turkey actually wants out of this moment and whether Washington is willing to provide it. What Turkey wants, if you look at its behavior over the last decade, is strategic autonomy. It wants to be inside NATO enough to benefit from the security umbrella and the economic relationships that come with Western alliance membership, but outside enough that it can maintain its relationships with Russia and Iran, pursue its own regional agenda in Syria and the Caucasus and North Africa, and not be treated as a subordinate member that simply takes orders from Washington and Brussels. That is a very difficult ask for an alliance that is built on the premise of shared values and coordinated decision-making. But it is the reality of where Turkey is, and the missile intercept does not change that underlying tension. It actually intensifies it, because now Turkey has demonstrated value to the alliance in a visible way, which gives Erdogan more room to demand recognition of Turkey's importance. For Iran, the immediate aftermath of this incident is about damage control and message management. If the missile was fired by a rogue faction, the Iranian government has an incentive to quietly communicate that to Turkey and to Western interlocutors, because the last thing Tehran wants right now is a confrontation with NATO on top of everything else it is dealing with. If the missile was state-directed, then Iran is sending a message of deterrence, signaling that it has reach, that it is willing to use that reach, and that any military operation targeting Iranian interests will have consequences that extend beyond the immediate theater. Either way, Iran is now in a position where its next move is being watched with enormous intensity by every intelligence service in the region and beyond. What Tehran does in the next 4 to 6 weeks will tell analysts a great deal about the internal balance of power inside the Islamic Republic and about its strategic intentions going forward. The broader global picture here is one of a world that is reorganizing itself at a speed that most Americans are not fully tracking, because the daily news cycle tends to present these events as isolated incidents rather than as chapters in a much longer story. The story is about the unraveling of the post-Cold War order, the order that was built on American unipolarity, on the assumption that NATO would remain cohesive and expansionist, on the idea that economic integration would gradually bring countries like Iran and Russia into a rules-based international system. That story is over. It has been over for some time. What is replacing it is a messier, more multipolar world in which regional powers like Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, India, and others are pursuing their own interests with much greater independence, in which the old alliance structures are being tested in new ways, and in which the United States has to decide what kind of power it wants to be in a world it no longer unilaterally defines. That decision, what kind of power does the United States want to be, is not being made in a coherent, strategic way right now. It is being made through a series of reactive choices, through budget decisions, through the personal instincts of whoever happens to be in the White House, and through the lobbying of domestic interest groups that have very strong views about the Middle East and about Iran specifically. That is a fragile and dangerous way to navigate a moment of genuine historical transformation. Because the countries on the other side of these decisions, Iran, Russia, China, are making their choices with much longer time horizons in mind. They are not governed by 4-year election cycles. They are not subject to the kind of media pressure that can completely reshape American foreign policy based on a single news cycle. They are playing a different kind of game, and the missile over Turkey is one move in that game. What happens next, in the most concrete sense, is that NATO will hold emergency consultations. The United States will likely increase its naval and air presence in the Eastern Mediterranean in the short term as a visible deterrent signal. There will be diplomatic communications with Tehran through back channels, almost certainly through Oman, which has historically served as a quiet intermediary between Washington and Tehran. Turkey will use this moment to press its case for a recalibration of its relationship with the alliance. Iran will assess its options carefully, and the internal debate in Tehran between factions that want escalation and factions that want to use this crisis to get back to a diplomatic track will intensify. And somewhere in all of that, the nuclear question, Iran's nuclear program, which has continued to advance, will come back to the center of the conversation because it never really left. The nuclear file is the underlying current beneath everything happening in this region. Iran has accumulated enough enriched uranium that the technical pathway to a nuclear weapon, if the political decision were made, is now measured in weeks rather than years. That is a threshold that changes the strategic calculus for every country in the region. It changes what Israel is willing to do. It changes what Saudi Arabia is calculating about its own nuclear options. It changes what Turkey thinks about its long-term security needs. And it changes what the United States can realistically demand in any diplomatic framework. A missile intercept over Turkey is a visible, dramatic event, but the quiet, grinding advance of Iran's nuclear program is the development that actually reshapes the security architecture of the entire Middle East, and possibly the world, more fundamentally than any single missile ever could. So when you watch the coverage of this event unfold over the coming days and weeks, and when you see the statements from NATO officials and American politicians and Turkish spokespeople, hold all of that in the context of this larger picture. The missile was real, the intercept was real, the alliance solidarity statements will be real. But the deeper reality is a world in transition in which the old rules are breaking down, in which the countries that understood this transition earliest are already positioning themselves for what comes next, and in which the United States is still, in many ways, trying to manage a world that no longer exists. Understanding that gap between the world as it is being publicly described and the world as it actually functions is the most important thing any American can do right now.